entirely of infinitesimal points. What if the numbers being traversed were composed of finite segments? What can a traveler traverse an infinite number of finite segments? In other words, can he travel an infinite distance? This is Dr. Beckwith's real point in claiming that you can't do that. He is trying to say that it is impossible to traverse an infinite distance. But again, he's simply wrong. It is entirely possible for an infinite being to travel an infinite distance, because they have an infinite length of time to do so. It's very interesting. Rationally, any infinite being can traverse an infinite distance. In fact, such a being could traverse an infinite number of infinite distances. This is the mathematical error of Dr. Beckwith's claim against LDS doctrine. The theological error, however, is even more important than the mathematical error, because Mormon theology teaches that not only God, but all of mankind have existed for eternity in one form or another. Thus, everyone who has ever existed on this planet, or everyone who will ever exist on this planet, has traversed, or is capable of traversing, an infinite distance, based on our theology of the eternal existence of mankind, as well as God, as well as the universe. We have already traveled infinite distances. That is logical when dealing with the infinite. Now, in Beckwith's theology, we are creatures. We had an absolute beginning, and therefore we are finite. But I'm not interested in Neoplatonic metaphysics. I want to go by the Bible. I want to go by the Scriptures. If Beckwith is going to argue against the LDS concepts, then he has to legitimately capture the essence of the LDS theology. And it teaches that everything and everyone really is infinite. Based on that premise, you now have to argue. You can't use your own assumptions, conclusions, and limitations and take those assumptions, put them onto Mormonism, and then claim you've refuted Mormonism because there's contradictions. That's not how the argument works. If you're going to take Mormonism on, you have to take on Mormonism, not your interpretation of it. Now, Dr. Beckwith's theological problem with the second premise doesn't end there. He also has a theological problem concerning God. The issue with God as Beckwith understands him with his own argument. It's very interesting that his position challenges the very concept of infinity itself. Beckwith says there is no such thing. No infinity whatsoever. The real issue is not whether an infinite distance can be traversed, but whether or not a being can exist for the eternity that it would take to traverse such a distance. Surprisingly, Dr. Beckwith, speaking on behalf of classical theism, interestingly enough, claims not. He says, if the universe had no beginning, then every event has been preceded by an infinite number of events. But if one can never traverse an infinite number, one could never have arrived at the present day, since to do so would have involved traversing an infinite number of days. Therefore, since no one can travel for an infinite length of time or an infinite distance, we wouldn't have arrived yet here today. But here we are. And therefore he says there is no such thing as infinity. The problem with that stance is it completely denies the very possibility of infinite or eternal existence altogether. Now, this should shock us. We're saying, wait a minute. That's a very dangerous proposition for anyone who believes in an eternal God. And yet that is the proposition Beckwith makes, because he's bringing in the assumptions from Neoplatonic philosophy. He's not going by the biblical record or by any modern revelation whatsoever. He doesn't believe in modern revelation anyway, but he's certainly not going by the biblical record. Beckwith apparently does not believe that God has existed through an eternity of real time. Either that, or he must believe that God is Aristotle's unmoved mover. Either way, he's in trouble with his stance. If he has not traversed any distance whatsoever during his eternal existence, then he's simply Aristotle's unmoved mover. But that means God doesn't do a thing, hasn't done a thing, and isn't even in existence. Aristotle's unmoved mover was refuted a long time ago. Infinity today completely destroys that concept. The idea that even God himself cannot traverse an infinite distance can only be maintained if you're going to accept Greek metaphysics, and I don't. God exists outside of space and time so that he does not traverse distance or time, but the Bible never teaches that. That's metaphysics. The Bible teaches God is directly involved in time. And I'll show you that. Dr. Beckwith clearly requires this conclusion. It is confirmed by his recognition that events are a mere objective measure of time than a specific time period, such as a day. An event can be of any duration and is independent of mass and other influences that affect time under the general theory of relativity. And furthermore, events are a measure of time that would necessarily exist in the pleroma, if there were such a place. Thus, events occur in either the Mormon or the metaphysical universe. Otherwise, there's no God at all. So it doesn't help to say God exists in a pleroma outside of space and time. There are still events occurring from both God and us, and therefore he is in space and time. Events have to occur somewhere and some when, regardless of where. But where is just another word for space. God did not invent time and space. They have always existed as well. That's the fascinating part about this. As long as an event is measurable in the perception of any observer, even God himself, then it constitutes a definable way to measure time. Whether it's from God or us, an event measures time, because it has a beginning and it has an end. Therefore, it has time. And the relativistic aspect of time is mentioned in the Scriptures also. One day to God is like 1,000 years to man, he says in 2 Peter 3:8. So that we can see this concept of the relativity of time, that God is in time, not outside of time. It's just a different time. We get the same thing with the book of Abraham. For all these reasons, the measurement of events is the ideal way to compare the Mormon concept of the universe with the Greek idea of a metaphysical universe. Here's why. If an event occurs in the real space-time universe or in the non-spatio-temporal pleroma imagined by classical theists, it could still be defined as measurable and an analyzable quantity. Namely, the difference between the start and the finish of the event. Doesn't matter where. Inside time or outside of time. It has a measurable quantity. The shortest possible event or portion of an event could be defined as dt in our calculus, an event infinitesimally short in duration. Even in the pleroma, an active God would experience dt that meet this definition.